Hi developers, in this video we'll learn the basics of infrastructure as code using Microsoft Azure. The goal here is that instead of using the Azure portal in order to create the resources needed to run our web application, we'll be relying on a JSON file that we call it ARM template that will contain the description of all the resources we want to create. So inside this JSON file we'll be saying that we want to create a web app, a database, and a SQL Azure instance. In the previous video we have seen how we can create a resource group, then create this SQL instance database, and also create the web app to host our web app and our SQL Server instance. And we have done that manually using the Azure portal. Here, using IAC, infrastructure as code, will be able to do the same operations but using a JSON file that will contain the description of the infrastructure that I want to create. So that this JSON file will tell Microsoft Azure that we want to create a new resource group that contains a web app and also contains a SQL instance and a database. So let's learn how to create this ARM template and how to deploy it to Microsoft Azure. Here, from within Visual Studio, I have my ASP.NET Core web application that contains a database, and here we do have the connection string for that database. And I want to deploy the infrastructure needed in order to host this web app and this database. So what I will do here is that I will add the project that manipulates the ARM template. For that, I'll go to my solution, then right click, and here I'll choose add a new project. This will show me these templates. So from here I'll choose Visual C#, then I choose Cloud, and under Cloud you can see that we have multiple options right here. I'll choose Azure Resource Group. I'll keep the name by default. Then I click OK in order to create this resource group. Then here we do have a sort of wizard that tells us that asks what sort of template we want to use. So we can start with a blank template, then we add all the resources to this template. And we have some other templates that help us to get started. So we do have the minimum code required in this template. So we do have templates for web apps, for Ubuntu server, for Windows virtual machines, for Docker containers, Logic apps, and so on. And we also have a template for web app. And better than that, we do have a template for web app and a SQL instance. So I'll choose this one, as here that's exactly what I want to do in this demo. I click OK. This will create the project with the templates needed right here. So here it is, my project, and here we see that in here we do have 3 files. So let's go by one. Let's start by the JSON file, which is called here website SQL database.json. So this is the main file or the ARM template that contains the description of the infrastructure we want to create on Microsoft Azure. This file contains some parameters with variables, resources, and so on. So let's start by the parameters. From here, we do have all the parameters needed to create the infrastructure. So the first one right here is the hosting plan name, and this is going to be the host plan for my web app. So if we go back to Azure portal, right here, with every web app we create, we do have a service plan. So we do need to provide a name for that service plan that can manipulate which tier of Azure website we are using, if it's a standard or basic or whatever. So here it's the first parameter. Then we do have another parameters for the SKU name, SKU capacity, with default value to 1, and this is a description for the plans instance count, how many accounts we do have in that service plan. Then we do have the administrator login. So this is for the database. We do also have the administrator login password for the database, and note here the type is secure string instead of string. So the string right here, the password will be hidden inside this file. Then we do have another parameter, which is right here the database name. So we can change that value, and note here we don't have a default value for the database name. We'll go back to this later. Then we do have some other parameters like collation and edition, max size bytes also, then requested service object name. And after this section of parameters, we do have another section for variables, and if you expand this one, we do have two variables. The first one is the website name. The website name is the name for my web app. Right here and the previous web app that we have created, we specified this web app name, which is unique. So here the value for this website name, it tells here that it should be a unique string. So the value will be specified and at the time of runtime. That means at the time of this template is being executed by Microsoft Azure. At that time, Microsoft Azure will try to generate a unique string composed of 13 characters in order to be to act as a unique web app name. Then we'll do the same for the SQL Server name. So for my SQL Azure instance, here we'll try to generate a unique name for the SQL instance. So those are the two variables, and here the difference between variables and parameters is that parameters or variables are specific or created at the time of running the template, but parameters could be specified even before, during the development time. And for that reason, here we do have the default values specified right here. After parameters and variables, we do have the main region here, which is resources. So resources right here will describe the resources that will be created. Here for our resource group, we did created service plan, and we did created the web app, database, and the SQL instance. Here it's the role of the resources region to describe how we create those resources with the description of the parameters needed for each resource. So let's start by the first one. Note that here we do have multiple resources. So let's start by the first one. Here the first resource is of type SQL Server. So this is our SQL Server instance that will be created inside Azure, or let's say SQL Azure instead of saying SQL Server. So to create the SQL Server instance, we need to use the administrator login and the administrator login password. For that, here we'll be referencing our two parameters, administrator login and administrator login password, that we have discussed earlier inside the parameters section right here, administrator login and administrator login password. So those parameters are used from within the resources region in order to be referenced right here and used multiple times. For that, we are using the syntax parameters, then the name of the variable. We are also specifying the API version, so here we are using this one from 2014. It's not a preview, but it's used in production. This SQL Server instance have itself some other resources. So it have a database resource. For here we do have the type databases. The name for this resource will be the name specified at the parameters type or parameters name database name. Then we do have the properties for this database. So we have the edition, the collation, max size bytes, and so on. We do also have the firewall rules for that database. Let's now move to the second resource, which is here of type Microsoft.web/server farms, and this is our hosting plan name. For that, it's using the parameter hosting plan name. Note that here we do have the parameter or the property location, which will be the location of the resource group. So one of the best practices when using Azure or any cloud provider is that all the resources from within a resource group should be located at the same region. For that, here for all the resources, their location is always the same location of my resource group plan. The third resource right here is the website. So here for the website, it depends on the hosting plan name. So the hosting plan name should be, or the hosting plan should be created before the creation of the website. Our website will have some properties like the name, and here we are using the variable website name that will be created at the time of deploying this template, because it needs to verify if this name exists or not. For that, when we go to Azure and create a new resource specifying the web app, right here, if we choose some name, for example this one, it tells me that it's not available. But if I change the value for this one right here, then it tells me it's available. So it needs to check the name at the creation of the template. Maybe someone else gets that name just seconds before me deploying my ARM template. The web app itself has some other resources here of type config, and the configuration here will write inside the connection strings. At the Azure template, that's the equivalent of going to the web app. So if I go back here to my resource groups, go to any web app that I have created, you can see that here we have application settings. And inside application settings, one of the settings we do have is the connection strings. And here we do have the value of the connection string that we can use during the running of the web app. And here we'll be creating the connection string for this web app. Here by default, the template generated a connection string called default connection. Default connection will try to create the value for this connection string. So it tells here that it's a concatenation of different values. So it will start by data source equal TCP, then it will try to get the name for the SQL instance. For here it's using the variable SQL server name, and it's using the syntax fully qualified domain name so that it will get the extension .database.azure.net. Then it will concatenate the other parameters for the port number, then the catalog, and here it will need the name of my database name. For that, here it's using again the parameter database name. Then it will concatenate the user ID, which here will be referencing the administrator login, then the SQL Server name, and then the value for my passwords. Here, if I keep it like this, the name of this connection string will be named default connections. So this means here in this section I'll have, like I did have here, I'm a stable connection string, I'll have default connection. But that's not the good configuration for my web app. Why? Because if I go to app settings.json, right here I do have my connection string should be called connection, or should be called web app context. Here this my app settings references a web server or a SQL server that is hosted on my local machine. For that, here I'm using local DB. But when my web app will be on Azure, this app settings should reference a SQL Azure database that is hosted on Azure. For that, the value right here of the connection string should be changed and should reference the web app that is hosted on Azure. That one, you have this value right here. So we do have the correct value, but not the correct name of the key. So here the key should be called web app context, the same name we use it right here. Why? Because right here, when my web app will be deployed on Azure, what will happen is that my web app will try to load the connection string from the app settings. So it will look for the web app context. It will find this one, but before doing that, before parsing the app settings right here, it will parse the app settings, the application settings from the Azure portal, from the application settings for that web app. So it will look for the keys stored inside right here. So here it will find MS table connection string. So that is not what it is looking for, because here it looks for web app context, because we did say in some point right here from web app context that we should look for web app context. We should look for a configuration, call it web app context. So it will look for web app context right here. It won't find it because here we only have MS table connection string. At that point, it will load the configuration, the value from app settings.json. So it will load this one right here, and we said this is this references a local DB. So for that, we need to add the connection string to here so that it can load it from here. You see that here we can do that manually, but we want to automate this using the ARM templates. For that, here we did I created the properties for the connection strings, a property for our connection string that should be named web app context. So make sure right here that you name this, or you rename this connection string to the one specified in your app settings. Another change we need to make right here is the type of the SQL instance. From within the Azure portal right here, you see that the specified type is SQL Azure. We do have some other properties like SQL Server, MySQL, or a custom one. Here we'll be using SQL Azure because we won't be using a SQL Server instance hosted on a virtual machine. We'll be using the one provided as a service by Microsoft Azure. So we need to change this type from SQL Server to SQL Azure. Here we do have some IntelliSense that can help us. So let's specify SQL Azure. Now I do have some other changes I want to make to this ARM template. Note that here the variables, we said those will be generated randomly during the running of this ARM template by Microsoft Azure. So it will generate a random 13 characters that will describe the name of my web app and the name of my SQL Server instance. I don't want to use random created names because I don't want my web app to be called like abq1320.azurewebsites.net. I want to specify a web app myself. For that, right here we can change the value right here to specify the name we want to use. Here I want to use this name. I already checked that it is always available, and I'll do the same for my SQL Server instance. And when specifying static values for those two variables, now I don't need to wait until the running of this ARM template to specify their values. So I can move those two variables to be parameters. So let's do that. The compiler is not happy right here because we must specify one of the types. So right here I'll go and make this an object in order to be able to add the type for this variable. So let's say, as we did have with the SKU name, we'll have the type and the default value. So for the type, we'll say this is of type string. Then it will have a default value, the value that we have specified right here. We'll do the same for the SQL Server name. So now you have the values for the web app and for the SQL instance. But if we look back here to the database name, you see that we don't have its value defined right here. So it is a parameter. So where its default value is defined. So here, if we go back to our project, we do have another file which is the parameters.json. And if we open this file, then here we do find some parameters defined right here, and from here we can decide which name or which value we want to assign those parameters. So here we can assign the name or the value for the administrator login and database name, and also the hosting plan name. So let's do that. Here for my hosting plan name, I'll use the same resource name right here. Then I call this my hosting plan. For the administrator login, instead of specifying null, I specify right here my name. Then for the database name, I specify here. Cool. So now we do have the values for those parameters defined in another file. It would be better if we do the same for those two other parameters, the website name and the SQL Server name. For that, right here, I'll go and copy those two and paste them right here in order to be able to specify their values. The compiler is not happy because right here we don't need to specify the type, and also we should change default value by value. Good. So now we have the values defined right here. I'll do the same for another property here, which is the administrator login password. So I'll take this variable right here and paste it just after the administrator login. So I'll say this is its value should be, and here it's not good practice to write the secure passwords in plain text. Here you can use Azure Key Vault, but for the sake of this demo I'll just write it right here. So from within this parameters file we did created the values for our variables, and what is important with this file is that we can use multiple files of the parameters in order to specify the values for each environment. So for the dev environment we might have another web app and another database which are different than the web app and the SQL instance used in our production environment. With those two files we do have a third file, which is the PS1 file or the PowerShell file. This one will be executed when we deploy the ARM template. So this will try to create all the resources one by one. Let's now try to deploy this ARM template. So to do that, we'll go to our project, right click, then here we choose deploy, then we click new. We'll have this window right here that takes the deployment template and then the template parameters file. It will then try to connect to my Azure subscription, because here I'm logged into Visual Studio, so it can recognize through my email and password which subscriptions I have. So here I have selected this one right here. Then I need to specify the resource group. You know that inside this template we didn't specify a name for the resource group, so we need to specify it in this wizard. Here we have the resource group that I have already in my Azure subscription, which are specified in this window. If we go to resource groups, so you can find those two resource groups which are the same, you can find right here. I don't want to deploy to those two resource groups. Instead, I want to create a new one. So I'll have this new window asking me for the name of my resource group I want to create. So I'll choose a name. Then I need to specify a location for my resource group. Here we do have multiple options, and I'll go and pick West Europe. Then click create. Once we have done that, here note that we have the option to edit the parameters that we have specified. Let's click save, then we click the button deploy, and this will try to connect to Azure. It will upload the website database JSON and the parameters file inside Azure, and then through this window, the output, we can see the log from the execution of this template. And here you note that we do have an error. The error here tells us that it didn't find the SQL Server name. It didn't find the variable called SQL Server name. Wow, that's because we did make a mistake right here. When we change it, the variable SQL Server name and website name from variable to parameters, they are still referenced from here as variables. And you see here the compiler is not happy because it didn't find in this section variable a variable called website name, because now it is a parameter. So let's go to fix that. It's simple, just we need to change the variables by parameters. Now the error is gone. But we did have some other errors which are the same right here, so let's go to fix them one by one. And because here there are multiple errors, I'll try to fix them using the Control F. I look for variables and I'll try to replace them with parameters. Here, make sure you select the current document, then I'll go and replace all of them. 23 occurrences were replaced. Let's save the template and let's deploy again. Here, when I want to deploy again, I did created the resource group that I want to deploy to. So for that, I can just select it and click deploy again. Now it tells us that our template is valid. And here it started creating or provisioning some of the resources. I can check that from the Azure portal. So here, if I go to refresh my resource groups, I can see that here I do have a new one added. If I go inside it, then I can see that some of the resources are provisioned. So here I provisioned the web app, the SQL instance, and also the some other resources for the hosting plan and so on. And at the end here tells that it successfully deployed the template to our resource group. So if I go back to Azure and hit refresh, then I should be able to see all the resources that I specified in my JSON file. So here from within, going through the portal and creating each resource manually, we did have the description for all these resources, describe it in a JSON file. We deployed this JSON file to Microsoft Azure and it created all those resources automatically and it configured them as we want. So let's check if everything was done successfully as we wanted it to be. So if we go here to our web app, we want to check if it writes successfully the values for application settings. So here we should see the web app context defined as application settings inside the connection strings. And here we do have the value for our web app context. Right here it have the value for the database that it have created, and here the type is specified successfully as SQL Azure. Now let's try to go to browse this web app. So if I go to browse right here, then we can find that here the web app is created, but we don't have yet the instance of our web app because here we only deployed the infrastructure and not the our web app and our database. In a previous video, I have showed you how you can publish your web app through here the right click publish a profile right here. So this is a bad practice to do publishing through the Visual Studio right here, and it is also, let's say, we can say it's also a bad practice to deploy the ARM template through Visual Studio manually right here. So what we should be doing here is deploying the ARM template and the web app through DevOps profile or through the continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. And this is gonna be what we'll be doing in the next video. So join me in the next video to show you how we can deploy the ARM template and our web app and database using VSTS.